In the early 1980s, there was a proposal for a big resort and harbour development in Nelly Bay. It would have reclaimed a big section of the reef flat. I hadn't engaged with that project until I searched the reef flat at Nelly Bay and found big numbers of stone tools scattered across the reef flat. There were axes, there were pebble hammers, there were cores, there were lots of flakes from manufacture. I reported this to the authorities and linked up with the campaigners, a group called Island Voice, who were campaigning against this development, and joined their campaign. Claims had been, because of my interest in archaeology and my ability to make stone tools, was a skill that I'd learned over the previous few years, claims were made that we greenies had verily made, collected and deposited all these stone tools on the reef flat, which was definitely not the case. It's something I would never even consider. It was a complete coincidence that I'd discovered those stone tools on a proposed development site. I'd notified the authorities, so the Aboriginal rangers came over and checked it out, followed by large numbers of academics who conducted more studies, and a large salvage collection of thousands of artefacts from the reef flat surface. My motivation was partly my interest in archaeology, but also against the big development. I'd been involved in the Florence Bay campaign before, and so I got involved in that. Now, as interest in the Aboriginal cultural values of that, the Shorty O'Neill, an old political campaigner for Aboriginal interests, brought his group from Happy Valley, out near the airport and the town common, brought them over to camp on the island to defend this cultural asset on the Nelly Bay Harbour. Now, in part of that, they planted an Aboriginal flag on the reef flat to say, this is ours, this is precious to us. Now, divisions in the island community were deepening at this stage for and against the development. So people wanted a safe harbour. They thought, a resort would be beaut. Picnic Bay can't handle many more boats or vessels or traffic than it is already. Yeah, valid thinking of jobs for locals and such like. But the racist sentiments of the island came to the fore when Aborigines had the effrontery to come here to what was pretty well exclusively a white island at that stage, white population. And after closing time at the Picnic Bay pub one night, they were in a state of agitation. They came over, one bloke, Warren, I've forgotten his surname, swam out, broke the flagpole, stole the flag, and they took it back to Picnic Bay Hotel and burnt it in front of the hotel. So then they borrowed Shorty's precious flag from his time in London that he'd flown. And he said, all right, it was stolen and burnt as well, destroyed. So then they painted, bless them, they painted an Aboriginal flag on a tea towel and they put that up, and it too was stolen and destroyed. Now, during the further investigations by archaeological consultants into the stone tool scatter on the reef flat, a number of test holes were dug with a big excavator down through the deposits on the reef flat to the beach rock deep below, the hard aggregated stone layer. And in one of those holes, the excavator dug deep, 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 right down to the bottom, and up on one of the teeth of the bucket on the excavator was a little stone axe from 3 metres deep down below all those thousands of years of deposits on the reef flat. A beautiful little ground edge stone axe. And Charlie Rasmussen, the supervising engineer, spotted it and called the attention to the driver and had the bucket brought to him, and he plucked that little stone axe from that tooth. And what a wonderful little example of the long-term Aboriginal occupation.
And it showed that you hadn't planted them.
When the reporters used to come and talk about what was the news here, they'd say to each other, "What's the angle to this story?" And we'd say, "Oh, well, it's theft of public land and it's loss of Aboriginal cultural heritage." And they'd look at each other, the journalists, and they'd say, "Well, we think it's the divided community." And we'd roll our eyes and go, "Here we go, same old divided community thing." But the community was very divided, and those divisions lingered for many, many years. But the proposal for the safe harbour didn't die, as is manifest now. At Nelly Bay, we have quite a wonderful safe harbour which handles huge volumes of traffic, which we hadn't envisaged at the time. And there is a marina there. Of course, they always said, "Oh no, it's not going to be a marina, it's just about a safe harbour." Well, of course it was going to be a marina, and so it is. Now, during our campaign, we used to sort of look across the sea to Townsville and think, NQCC, we're not getting much support from NQCC in our struggle. And they were under more conservative leadership at that time. But we, Island Voice, looked on askance, I think, by the NQCC leadership at that stage, that we were just a bit too radical and noisy, and, it's all a bit too much kerfuffle over there. And at one stage, in about 85 or 86, the developers thought, "Oh, we know how to divide and rule this debate. We'll threaten to develop Florence Bay instead." So they did loudly proclaim that if they couldn't get Nelly Bay, putting aside their claims that this was all about a safe harbour for Nelly Bay, Florence Bay is completely unsuitable for that. They said, "Oh, we'll go for Florence Bay and put a resort there. That'd be a great thing, wouldn't it?" Well, the NQCC leadership, academics and all pro-conservation people in Townsville, it seemed, suddenly thought, "Oh, well, if Nelly Bay doesn't go ahead as proposed and Florence Bay gets developed, that'd be terrible." So they united famously against the idea that Florence Bay might be developed instead. And since then there's a belief amongst that group, well, good on them, that they had saved Florence Bay. Well, we felt we'd saved Florence Bay back in 1981, thanks very much, but never mind. It all came to pass, and Alistair Birtles actually said to me, he said, "Well, I wrote the proposal to actually include Florence Bay in the national park." And I said, "Well, good Alistair, but we saved it first." Anyway, squabble, doesn't matter. Florence Bay is safe. Yeah. And the Nelly Bay Harbour proceeded in the end in fits and starts. In about 1988, they actually dug a hole and built a stone wall around it. And then the money died, and in a tail end to that story, after the interest in that Aboriginal cultural heritage, the traditional owners, Woolgaroo Kabar people, returned to the island, led by Arthur Johnson, an elder and leader of Woolgaroo Kabar people. He came back, followed by a lot of his descendants, his children, family, and they live here to this day as permanent residents of Magnetic Island. And many islanders can count the Johnsons amongst their friends, their dear friends, and they live happily on their own traditional lands at last. The last Aborigines, Woolgaroo Kabar people, having been evicted in about 1920 and sent to Palm Island into poverty there. So there's a sense of justice and of completion, of that just act, that they have returned and have claimed some native title rights here on Yunbenun, Magnetic Island.